Welcome to a tour of Berlin in the 1800s, a century that would transform a modest Prussian capital into one of Europe's most dynamic and powerful cities. Using advanced AI technology, we'll be bringing centuries-old engravings, paintings, and photographs to life as photorealistic scenes, giving you an authentic glimpse into what life was actually like in 19th century Berlin, Germany. At the start of the 1800s, Berlin was home to roughly 170,000 people, a respectable size, but nowhere near the giants like London or Paris. By 1900, that number had exploded to over 2 million, making Berlin the third largest city in Europe. This was a century of unprecedented change. Napoleon's occupation, the rise of Prussian militarism, the failed revolutions of 1848, the unification of Germany in 1871, and the birth of modern industrial society. Berlin became the capital of the German Empire and a center of science, culture, and innovation that rivaled any city on earth. But beneath the triumphal monuments and grand boulevards lay a city of grinding poverty, overcrowded tenements, and stark inequality. The same streets that witnessed royal parades also saw workers' uprisings and the birth of socialist movements. At the end of this journey, we'll show you the revolutionary fervor of 1848 and 1918, when Berliners took to the streets demanding freedom and democracy in explosive moments that shook the foundations of European power. The Brandenburg Gate, symbol of a city. This is the Brandenburg Gate, Berlin's most iconic monument, painted shortly after its completion in 1791. Though technically built in the late 1700s, it defined Berlin throughout the entire 19th century and beyond. Designed by Karl Gotthard Langhans in the neoclassical style, it was inspired by the Propylaea gateway to the Acropolis in Athens. The gate stands 26 meters high, with 12 massive Doric columns, creating 5 passageways. Only royalty were permitted to use the central passage. Atop the structure stands the quadriga, a sculpture of the goddess Victoria riding a chariot drawn by 4 horses, created by Johann Gottfried Schadow. In 1806, Napoleon's armies marched through this gate after defeating Prussia at the Battle of Jena. Napoleon was so impressed by the quadriga that he ordered it dismantled and shipped to Paris as war booty. When Prussia helped defeat Napoleon in 1814, the sculpture was triumphantly returned to Berlin, and an iron cross was added to Victoria's staff, transforming her into a symbol of German victory. Throughout the 1800s, the Brandenburg Gate witnessed every major event in Berlin's history: military parades celebrating Prussian victories, the Revolution of 1848, the proclamation of the German Empire in 1871, and countless royal processions. The area around the gate was relatively open, though horse manure and mud made the unpaved roads difficult to traverse in bad weather. Today, the Brandenburg Gate remains standing, having survived World War II bombing and decades as a symbol of the divided Cold War Berlin. It now stands as a monument to German reunification and democracy. Unter den Linden, Berlin's Grand Boulevard. This engraving shows Unter den Linden, under the linden trees, Berlin's most prestigious boulevard stretching from the Brandenburg Gate to the Royal Palace. The tree-lined avenue was originally laid out in the 1642, but it came into its full glory during the 1800s as Prussia's power grew. The wide boulevard was flanked by linden trees, creating shaded walkways where wealthy Berliners promenaded in their finest clothes. Grand palaces, embassies, hotels, and cafes lined the street. The elegant buildings housed aristocrats, government officials, and the wealthy merchant class that was beginning to rival the nobility in wealth and influence. But the street had 2 faces. While carriages carrying princes and generals rolled down the center, the sidewalks teemed with all classes of Berlin society. Street vendors sold newspapers and sausages, beggars pleaded for coins, prostitutes solicited customers, and pickpockets worked the crowds. The contrast between elegant facades and street-level reality was stark. The cafes and beer halls along Unter den Linden became centers of political discussion and sometimes revolutionary plotting. Students, intellectuals, and workers debated the ideas of the day: liberalism, nationalism, socialism, often under the watchful eye of police informants. In the early 1800s, much of the street was still unpaved, meaning mud in wet weather and choking dust when dry. Horse manure was everywhere, collected by street sweepers, but never fully eliminated. The smell could be overwhelming on hot summer days. Gas lighting was gradually introduced from the 1822 onward, making evening strolls safer and more fashionable. Today, Unter den Linden remains one of Berlin's main boulevards, completely rebuilt after World War II devastation. The Royal Palace, heart of Prussian power. This is the Berlin Stadtschloss, the Royal Palace, which stood on the Spree River Island at the very heart of the city. Originally a medieval castle, it was continuously expanded from the 15th century onward, but took its final Baroque form largely in the 1700s. Throughout the 1800s, this was the primary residence of Prussian kings and later German emperors. The massive complex contained over 600 rooms, including throne rooms, ballrooms, private apartments, chapels, and galleries filled with art treasures. The palace's imposing facades dominated the cityscape, a constant reminder of royal authority. Life inside the palace was governed by rigid court protocol. Thousands of servants, guards, and officials kept the complex running. Aristocrats competed for access to the monarch, angling for positions, titles, and influence. Grand ceremonies marked state occasions, with military parades in the square before the palace. But the palace also symbolized everything revolutionaries despised. In March 1848, during the revolution, protesters massed in the Schlossplatz, demanding constitutional reforms. Nervous troops fired into the crowd, killing hundreds. The king was forced to appear on the balcony and salute the corpses of the March Fallen, a profound humiliation for Prussian monarchy. After the failed revolution, the monarchy reasserted control, but the palace became even more of a contested symbol. When Wilhelm I was proclaimed German emperor in 1871 at Versailles, not Berlin, the palace became the center of a powerful empire, but also a target for growing socialist and democratic movements. The area around the palace was far from pristine. The narrow medieval streets of Old Berlin pressed close to the palace walls, filled with shops, taverns, and workshops. The smell from the nearby Spree River, which received raw sewage, was often terrible. Only in the later 1800s were these cramped quarters cleared to create more imposing public spaces. The palace was severely damaged in World War II, and the East German government demolished it in 1950 as a symbol of Prussian militarism. Controversially, Germany began reconstructing the palace's exterior in 2013, and it reopened as the Humboldt Forum Museum in 2021. Museum Island, Temple of Culture. This view shows the Altes Museum, the first building of what would become Berlin's famous Museum Island. Designed by Carl Friedrich Schinkel and completed in 1830, it represents the neoclassical ideal of a public temple to art and knowledge. The building's imposing colonnade of 18 Ionic columns and grand rotunda were deliberately designed to evoke ancient Athens and Rome. King Friedrich Wilhelm III commissioned it to make Prussia's royal art collections accessible to the public, a revolutionary idea that reflected Enlightenment values. Throughout the 1800s, Museum Island expanded dramatically. The News Museum opened in 1855, the Alte National Gallery in 1876, and the Bode Museum in 1904. These institutions made Berlin a cultural capital rivaling Paris and London. Middle-class Berliners flocked to view ancient treasures and contemporary art, participating in the growing culture of self-education and civic pride. However, admission wasn't truly free or universal. While theoretically open to all, entrance fees and opening hours during working days meant the museums primarily served the educated middle and upper classes. Working people had little time or money for cultural pursuits. The museums were part of a broader transformation of the Spree Island, from a crowded medieval quarter into a monumental district. This required demolishing old neighborhoods, displacing the poor and working-class families who lived there, an early example of what we'd now call gentrification. Today, Museum Island is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the world's greatest museum complexes, though the buildings were heavily damaged in World War II and restoration continues. The Reichstag, birth of a parliament. This shows the Reichstag building under construction in the 1880 seconds. Designed by Paul Wallert, it was completed in 1894 to house the parliament of the newly unified German Empire. The massive Renaissance revival structure with its prominent dome symbolized Germany's emergence as a great power, but the Reichstag also represented the tensions at the heart of Imperial Germany. The parliament had limited real power. The Kaiser and his appointed chancellor controlled foreign policy and the military. Elections were held, but the system was designed to favor conservative rural areas over industrial cities where socialists were gaining strength. Inside, deputies debated everything from tariffs to colonial policy, but ultimate decisions rested with the emperor. The building became a stage for political theater, where socialists like August Bebel delivered passionate speeches demanding workers' rights and democracy, while conservatives defended the traditional order. The inscription Dem deutschen Volke, to the German people, wasn't added until 1916. During World War I, a belated acknowledgement that sovereignty rested with the people, not the monarchy. The area around the Reichstag was part of Berlin's western expansion in the late 1800s. New government buildings, embassies, and upscale residences transformed former fields into an official district. But just blocks away, working-class neighborhoods like Moabit housed factory workers in crowded conditions. The Reichstag famously burned in 1933, giving Hitler a pretext to seize dictatorial power. Heavily damaged in World War II, it was restored, and since 1999 has served as the parliament building of reunified Germany. Alexanderplatz, the common people's square. This is Alexanderplatz, named after Russian Tsar Alexander I's visit in 1805. Throughout the 1800s, this was the heart of working-class Berlin, a chaotic, crowded commercial center far removed from the elegant western districts. The square bustled with street markets selling everything imaginable: food, clothes, household goods, and livestock. Cattle and pig markets operated here until the 1880 seconds, filling the air with the sounds and smells of animals. Street performers, beggars, pickpockets, and prostitutes worked the crowds. Police kept watch, but crime was rampant. The buildings surrounding the square housed shops, taverns, cheap lodging houses, and workshops. Upper floors contained cramped apartments where working families lived in conditions of shocking overcrowding, often 10 or more people sharing 2 rooms with no running water or indoor toilets. Alexanderplatz was a transportation hub. Horse-drawn omnibuses and later horse-drawn trams converged here. In 1882, Berlin's first electric tram line began operating. The square constantly rang with the noise of iron wheels on cobblestones, vendors hawking wares, and the shouts of crowds. This was also a center of radical politics. Workers gathered in beer halls to discuss socialist ideas, often under police surveillance. During times of unrest, Alexanderplatz became a flashpoint for demonstrations and confrontations with authorities. The contrast with wealthy Western Berlin was stark. While aristocrats promenaded unter den Linden, workers struggled for survival around Alexanderplatz. This geographic and social division would shape Berlin's politics for generations. Today, Alexanderplatz remains a major commercial center, though completely rebuilt after World War II destruction. The working-class character has largely vanished, replaced by modern shopping centers and high-rises. The Spree River, artery of industry. This view shows the Spree River flowing through central Berlin in the mid-1800s. The river was Berlin's economic lifeline, but also its sewer and source of disease. Barges crowded the water, hauling coal from Silesia, timber from Prussia's eastern forests, grain to feed the growing population, and manufactured goods from Berlin's expanding factories. The riverbanks teemed with warehouses, cranes, and docks. Stevedores loaded and unloaded cargo in all weather, dangerous work that paid poorly. But the Spree was horribly polluted. Factories dumped chemical waste directly into the water. Raw sewage from hundreds of thousands of people flowed in through drainage pipes. Slaughterhouses along the banks discharged blood and offal. The stench was overwhelming, especially in summer. Despite the pollution, people still drew drinking water from the river through public pumps. Unsurprisingly, cholera epidemics ravaged Berlin repeatedly throughout the 1800s, killing tens of thousands. The worst outbreak in 1831 killed over 1,400 people in just a few months. Only in the 1872 did Berlin begin building a modern sewer system under the direction of engineer James Hobrecht. This massive public works project gradually improved sanitation, though the Spree remained polluted well into the 20th century. The riverbanks also housed some of Berlin's worst housing, cramped tenements pressed right to the water's edge, their residents living with the constant smell and sight of industrial pollution. Children played along the filthy banks, and drownings were tragically common. Today, the Spree has been cleaned significantly and flows through the heart of reunified Berlin, lined with museums, government buildings, and cafes, a dramatic transformation from its industrial past. Kreuzberg and the tenements. How the other half lived. This image shows a typical Mietskasernen rental barracks in the Kreuzberg district, photographed in the 1890. These massive tenement blocks house Berlin's working class in conditions of appalling overcrowding. Berlin's population explosion in the 1800s created an urgent housing crisis. Developers built these 5- or 6-story apartment blocks with multiple courtyards, each courtyard surrounded by more apartments. Buildings could extend 300 feet deep into the block, with as many as 6 courtyards, each darker and more airless than the last. The front apartments facing the street were relatively desirable, with windows, light, and fresh air. But the majority of units faced interior courtyards where sunlight barely penetrated. The deepest courtyards were dark pits where the sun never reached ground level. Families of 6, 8, or 10 people crammed into 1- or 2-room apartments. They shared toilets in the stairwell, often one toilet for 30 or 40 people. There was no running water in apartments. Residents hauled water from courtyard pumps. In winter, these buildings were freezing. In summer, suffocatingly hot. Many families took in Schlafgänger, sleepers, lodgers who rented a bed for 8-hour shifts, so the bed was occupied around the clock by different workers on different shifts. Privacy was non-existent. Courtyards echoed with the sounds of daily life. Children crying, couples arguing, craftsmen hammering, and the constant clatter of activity, the smell of cooking, unwashed bodies, overflowing toilets, and garbage was overwhelming. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions. Tuberculosis, typhoid, and childhood illnesses killed thousands annually. Infant mortality rates in these districts were shockingly high in some years. 1 in 4 children died before their first birthday. Yet these buildings also fostered community. Neighbors knew each other intimately, helped in times of crisis, and organized together for better conditions. The tenements became centers of the growing labor movement and socialist organizing. Many of these buildings still stand today, though most have been renovated with modern plumbing and amenities. Kreuzberg, once a symbol of poverty, is now one of Berlin's trendiest neighborhoods. The Charité Hospital, Science and Suffering. This is the Charité Hospital, founded in 1710 but greatly expanded throughout the 1800s to become one of Europe's leading medical institutions. The name means charity, reflecting its original mission to treat plague victims and the poor. By the 1800s, the Charité was at the forefront of medical science. Rudolf Virchow, the father of modern pathology, worked here and revolutionized understanding of disease. Robert Koch, who discovered the bacteria causing tuberculosis and cholera, conducted his groundbreaking research at the Charité in the 1882. But the hospital was also a place of tremendous suffering. Before anesthesia became common in the 1840s, surgery was performed on conscious patients who were simply held down, while surgeons worked as quickly as possible. The screams of patients could be heard throughout the building. Infection was rampant. Doctors didn't yet understand germ theory and operated in street clothes without washing their hands between patients. Post-surgical infection killed more patients than the operations themselves. Hospital wards were crowded, unsanitary places where diseases spread easily. The poor who came to the Charité were often used as teaching subjects. Medical students observed surgeries and practiced procedures on charity patients, who had no choice but to submit. This exploitation was justified as necessary for medical progress, though wealthy patients received private care. Despite these grim realities, the Charité made genuine advances. By the late 1800s, adoption of antiseptic techniques dramatically improved survival rates. The hospital expanded continuously, adding new wards and research facilities. Today, the Charité is still one of Europe's largest and most prestigious university hospitals, continuing its dual legacy of cutting-edge research and public service. The Berlin Wall, not that one, the Customs Wall. This engraving shows one of the gates in Berlin's Zollmauer, the Customs Wall, built in the 1732s but maintained throughout the early 1800s. This 14-kilometer wall surrounded the city with 18 gates, but unlike the later Cold War wall, its purpose was taxation, not imprisonment. Guards at the gates collected taxes on goods entering the city, particularly the hated excise tax on food and other necessities. This tax hit the poor hardest, making basic necessities more expensive. Smuggling was rampant, with people sneaking food and goods over or around the wall to avoid the fees. The wall also served to control movement. Gates closed at night, and strangers entering the city could be questioned. This allowed police to monitor the population and exclude undesirables, vagrants, radicals, and anyone else authorities deemed suspicious. As Berlin grew, the wall became an impediment to expansion. The city was bursting at the seams, but building outside the wall meant missing out on city services and protection. Gradually, Berlin absorbed surrounding villages, and the wall became obsolete. By the 1862s, most of the wall was demolished, as Berlin underwent massive expansion. The gate locations became squares and traffic nodes. Potsdamer Platz, Hallesches Tor, and others place names that survive today, though the gates themselves are long gone. The wall's demolition symbolized Berlin's transformation from a controlled royal capital into a dynamic, expanding industrial metropolis. But it also meant the extension of taxes and police control over previously autonomous areas. Potsdamer Platz, from quiet crossing to urban chaos. This photograph from the 1892 shows Potsdamer Platz, which by then had become one of Europe's busiest intersections. The site of the former Potsdam Gate in the Customs Wall, it exploded into commercial prominence after the wall's demolition. 5 major streets converged here, along with omnibus lines, tram lines, and later elevated and underground railways. The cacophony was incredible. Horses' hooves on cobblestones, tram bells, vendors shouting, wheels clattering, and thousands of people navigating the chaos. In 1924, Potsdamer Platz would get Europe's first traffic light tower because the intersection had become so dangerous. But even in the 1892s, accidents were common. Horse-drawn vehicles collided regularly, and pedestrians risked their lives crossing the streets. The square became a magnet for commerce. Hotels, restaurants, cafes, shops, and later department stores surrounded it. The Hotel Fürstenhof was particularly luxurious, catering to wealthy travelers. The Café Josti was famous for its pastries and as a meeting place for artists and intellectuals, but alongside legitimate business, Potsdamer Platz attracted a demi-monde of pickpockets, prostitutes, con artists, and hustlers. The crowds and confusion provided perfect cover for criminal activity. Police maintained a station nearby but couldn't control everything. The area also marked a social boundary. To the west lay the wealthy district of Tiergarten. To the east and south lay working-class neighborhoods. The contrast between well-dressed bourgeois shoppers and ragged workers was visible everywhere. Potsdamer Platz was completely destroyed in World War II and then divided by the Berlin Wall. After reunification, it was rebuilt as a modern commercial district, now dominated by sleek towers, a far cry from the chaotic 19th century crossing. The University of Berlin, Temple of Learning. This is the Friedrich Wilhelms Universität, now Humboldt University, founded in 1810 during the Napoleonic occupation. Wilhelm von Humboldt designed it on revolutionary principles: research and teaching, united, academic freedom, and education as character development, not just job training. The university quickly became one of Europe's premier institutions. Philosophers like Hegel and Schopenhauer, scientists like Einstein, later, historians like Ranke, and countless other luminaries taught here. The university embodied Prussia's commitment to Bildung, self-cultivation, through learning. But it was also deeply elitist. University education was reserved for a tiny, privileged minority. Students came overwhelmingly from aristocratic or wealthy bourgeois families. Women were completely excluded until 1908. Working-class students were virtually non-existent. Student life combined serious scholarship with raucous socializing. Student corporations, Burschenschaften, were central to university culture. These fraternities engaged in ritualized sword dueling, heavy drinking, and nationalist politics. Facial scars from dueling were worn as badges of honor. These student groups were also hotbeds of political radicalism. In the early 1800s, they promoted German nationalism and liberalism, bringing them into conflict with conservative authorities. After the failed 1848 revolution, many became more reactionary, embracing aggressive nationalism and anti-Semitism. The university building itself, originally a palace, faced Unter den Linden in the heart of Berlin. Its prestigious location reflected the high status of academic learning in Prussian society, at least learning for the right sort of people. Today, Humboldt University remains one of Germany's most prestigious institutions, though its history is complicated by its role during the Nazi period. Moabit Prison, the other side of progress. This is Moabit Prison, built between 1842 and 1849 on the latest modern principles of incarceration. The massive complex could hold over 1,000 prisoners in individual cells, revolutionary at the time, as group cells were the norm. The prison was designed on the separate system, keeping prisoners in solitary confinement to encourage penitence and prevent contamination by other criminals. In practice, this meant years of crushing isolation that drove many prisoners insane. Conditions were harsh. Cells were tiny, perhaps 3 by 4 meters, with a cot, bucket, and small window. Prisoners worked long hours at repetitive tasks like picking oakum or sewing. Talking was forbidden. Any infraction brought punishment, reduced rations, darkness, or beatings. Moabit held common criminals but also political prisoners. Socialists, anarchists, and others who challenged the established order found themselves here. After the 1848 revolution failed, many revolutionaries spent years in Moabit's cells. The prison exemplified the paradox of 19th century progress. It represented enlightened reform compared to older dungeons and corporal punishment, but the psychological torture of long-term solitary confinement was arguably worse than older methods. Prison reform movements gradually challenged the separate system, arguing for rehabilitation over punishment. But change came slowly, and Moabit remained a place of suffering for generations. The prison continued operating through the Nazi era and East German period. It still functions as a prison today, though conditions have improved significantly from the 19th century regime. The Revolution of 1848, when Berlin fought for freedom. By March 1848, revolution was sweeping Europe. In Berlin, workers, students, and middle-class liberals demanded constitutional government, freedom of the press, and an end to police state surveillance. On March 18th, King Friedrich Wilhelm IV announced minor concessions, but crowds massed in the Schlossplatz, demanding more. Nervous cavalry troops tried to clear the square. Shots rang out, whether fired deliberately or by accident remains debated. The crowd erupted in fury, convinced the king had ordered a massacre. Barricades went up across the city within hours. This image shows the street fighting that raged through Berlin on March 18th and 19th. Revolutionaries tore up cobblestones to build barricades, blocking streets and creating defensive positions. They armed themselves with whatever they could find: hunting rifles, pistols, axes, iron bars, and stones. The Prussian army, one of Europe's finest, found itself fighting street by street against its own people. Artillery blasted barricades to rubble. Soldiers fired volleys into buildings where insurgents were positioned. The revolutionaries fought back with desperate courage. Over 2 days, approximately 300 people were killed, mostly civilians. The fighting was bitter and personal. Workers and craftsmen who had never imagined taking up arms found themselves facing professional soldiers. Young students inspired by liberal ideals died on the barricades alongside laborers fighting for bread and dignity. On March 19th, the king, shocked by the bloodshed and fearing the army couldn't hold the city, capitulated. He appeared on the palace balcony, removed his cap, and bowed to the corpses of the March Fallen laid out in the courtyard. It was a humiliating submission. For months, Berlin enjoyed new freedoms. A constituent assembly met to write a constitution. The press operated without censorship. Political clubs and meetings flourished. It seemed a new era had dawned. But the forces of reaction were regrouping. By autumn, the king felt strong enough to reassert control. In November, troops occupied Berlin, dissolved the assembly, and imposed a constitution that preserved royal power. The revolution had failed. Yet 1848 was not entirely defeated. Some reforms survived: the end of feudal obligations, limited press freedom, and the precedent that the people could challenge royal authority. The seeds were planted for future democratic movements. Industrial Berlin, the rise of the working class. This photograph from the 1880 seconds shows a factory in Berlin's industrial district. By the late 1800s, Berlin had transformed from an administrative capital into a major industrial center, producing machinery, chemicals, electrical equipment, and textiles. Companies like Siemens and AEG pioneered electrical engineering, making Berlin a leader in the new technology. Borsig manufactured locomotives that powered railways across Europe. Thousands of smaller workshops and factories produced everything from clothing to precision instruments. This industrialization created a massive working class. Migrants poured in from Prussia's eastern provinces and beyond, seeking factory work. These workers faced grueling conditions: 12 to 14-hour workdays, 6 days a week, in dangerous environments. Machinery maimed and killed workers regularly, with no compensation for injured workers or their families. Child labor was common until gradually restricted by laws in the late 1800s. Children as young as 8 or 9 worked in factories, their small size useful for cleaning under machines or working in tight spaces. The work stunted their growth and destroyed their health. Wages were barely enough to survive on. Women and children were paid even less than men. Workers lived in the overcrowded tenements we discussed earlier, their entire lives consumed by work and exhausted sleep. But workers began organizing. Trade unions formed despite being illegal or heavily restricted. The Social Democratic Party, founded in the 1860 seconds, grew into a mass movement representing working-class interests. Berlin became a center of socialist thought and activism. The government responded with repression. Bismarck's anti-socialist laws from 1878 to 1890 banned socialist organizations and publications, though the movement continued underground and ultimately emerged stronger. By 1900, Berlin's working class was a powerful political force that couldn't be ignored, setting the stage for the revolutionary upheavals of the early 20th century. The New Berlin: unification and imperial grandeur. After Prussia's victory in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71, the German Empire was proclaimed at Versailles on the 18th of January, 1871. Berlin, already Prussia's capital, became the capital of unified Germany. The city's importance skyrocketed. This painting shows the celebration in Berlin when news of victory arrived. Massive crowds filled the streets, waving flags and singing patriotic songs. The unification of Germany under Prussian leadership was the culmination of decades of nationalist aspirations. As the imperial capital, Berlin underwent massive transformation. Wide new boulevards were laid out. Monumental buildings rose to reflect Germany's new status as a great power. The population exploded as people flocked to the capital seeking opportunity. The Gründerzeit founding era saw frenzied economic growth and speculation. Fortunes were made overnight in stocks and real estate. New department stores like Wertheim and Tietz revolutionized shopping, their enormous glass and steel buildings palaces of consumption. Electric lighting appeared in the 1880 seconds, transforming nightlife. Berlin developed a reputation for sophistication and also decadence. Cabarets, theaters, music halls, and restaurants proliferated. The city never slept, and its nightlife became legendary. But rapid growth brought problems. Infrastructure struggled to keep pace. Housing shortages worsened. The gap between rich and poor widened visibly. Socialist movements grew stronger as workers organized to demand better conditions. Berlin also developed a reputation for innovation and modernity. The first electric elevated railway opened in 1902. The U-Bahn underground began operating in 1902. Automobiles appeared on streets alongside horse-drawn vehicles. The pace of change was dizzying. By 1900, Berlin stood as one of the world's great metropolises, dynamic, modern, cultured, industrial, and deeply divided between the wealthy West and the working-class North and East. The Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, Faith and Empire. This photograph shows the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, built between 1891 and 1906, as a monument to Kaiser Wilhelm I, German Emperor. The neo-Romanesque design with its 113-meter spire dominated Western Berlin's skyline. The church embodied the alliance between throne and altar in Imperial Germany. Protestantism was closely tied to the Prussian state, and the Kaiser was the supreme head of the Protestant church. The building's opulence, rich mosaics, stained glass, and marble reflected imperial grandeur, but it also represented the era's religious tensions. While Protestant churches received state support, Catholics and Jews faced varying degrees of discrimination. The Kulturkampf culture struggle of the 1872 saw Bismarck attempt to reduce Catholic influence through restrictive laws. Berlin's Jewish community grew significantly in the 1800s, becoming prominent in business, culture, and intellectual life. The grand new synagogue on Oranienburger Straße, completed in 1866, stood as a monument to Jewish achievement and integration. Yet, anti-Semitism was rising. Jews faced social discrimination and were increasingly scapegoated for Germany's problems by nationalist and conservative movements. This dark current would explode catastrophically in the next century. The Kaiser Wilhelm Church was heavily damaged in World War II bombing. Its ruined tower was preserved as a memorial, standing next to a modern church building a powerful reminder of the destruction of war. Revolution again. The end of an era. By November 1918, Imperial Germany was collapsing. 4 years of World War I had bled the country white. Hundreds of thousands were dead, millions wounded, the economy in ruins, and the people starving under British naval blockade. On the 9th of November 1918, revolution erupted in Berlin. Sailors, soldiers, and workers raised red flags and demanded an end to the war and the Kaiser's abdication. The SPD leader, Philipp Scheidmann, proclaimed a republic from the Reichstag balcony. Kaiser Wilhelm II fled to exile in the Netherlands. The German Empire, proclaimed just 47 years earlier with such triumph, was finished. A new democratic republic was born, the Weimar Republic, though its birth was bloody and contested. The following months saw fierce fighting in Berlin between different revolutionary factions. The moderate Social Democrats wanted parliamentary democracy. The radical Spartacists, including Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, wanted a communist revolution like Russia's. In January 1919, the Spartacist uprising was crushed by the army and Freikorps paramilitaries. Luxemburg and Liebknecht were captured and murdered. The violence foreshadowed the turbulent years ahead. The 1800s in Berlin had begun with Napoleonic occupation and ended with revolution and the birth of democracy. It was a century that saw the city transform from a modest royal capital into a teeming industrial metropolis of over 2 million people, a center of power, culture, and conflict that would shape the entire 20th century. The palaces, monuments, and institutions we've explored tell only part of the story. The grand facades of Imperial Berlin concealed grinding poverty, exploitation, and social conflict that would eventually explode in revolution. Yet this century also saw remarkable achievements: scientific breakthroughs, cultural flowering, technological innovation, and the growth of democratic movements demanding justice and dignity for all people. The tensions between progress and oppression, between wealth and poverty, between authority and freedom that defined 19th century Berlin continue to shape our world today. The city became a laboratory for modernity with all its promise and peril. If you enjoyed this journey through 19th century Berlin, please comment below what city and era you'd like to see next. Your suggestion might be featured in our next video. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the past.